Kia ora everyone at the street. It's great to be with you today. A little over 2 years ago, my wife Rochelle and I were sitting in a sterile little room at Middlemore Hospital. We'd been asked to sit in there after I'd had a colonoscopy. Colonoscopy was because I'd been losing weight for a few months and the doctor had run some tests and ordered a colonoscopy for me. And as I had finished that and was coming out of my sedation, they invited Rochelle and I to step out of the waiting room and step into this sterile little office. And we didn't say anything to each other, but we looked at each other across that room and were both thinking, this doesn't look good. And then the doctor who'd done the colonoscopy came in and sat down with us and looked at me with a very serious look on his face. And he told me that I had cancer. They'd discovered a tumour in my bowel. And like so many other Kiwis, I was diagnosed with bowel cancer. And then the next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. I had a CT scan to see whether or not that had grown, whether that had spread in my body. I then was booked in for an operation and met the surgeon and then had an operation a couple of weeks later, and they ended up removing half of my colon, half my bowel, to ensure they got the whole tumour. And then we were told that I'd have to have some chemotherapy and everything else. And then 4 days before Christmas in 2023, I was released from hospital and sent home to recover. It had been a whirlwind journey and in many ways a really tough journey. Cancer is an incredibly scary word. And the operation was a success. And when when I was released from hospital 4 days before Christmas, the surgeon came and told me that I was not going to need chemotherapy. They had got the whole tumour. It hadn't spread at all. They'd checked over 30 lymph nodes from my gut. There was no trace of the cancer at all. And in my follow-up scans and colonoscopies over these last 2 years, it looks like I'm completely clear. So that's really wonderful. But at the time, it was a really scary moment in our lives. And we had a period of time of a little over a week in between having the diagnosis that you have a tumour and being told the results of the CT scan that it looked like it hadn't spread. We had a little over a week where we had to face the reality of all kinds of options. Maybe the tumour was small, maybe I was going to need a lot of chemo and radiation, or maybe even I had stage 4 cancer and I only had months to live. And we had to wrestle with the reality of that for that short period of time before we were told it looked like it hadn't spread and that in fact was reality. A couple of months later, I was driving to a meeting at church with a good friend of mine. It was the first time he'd seen me since the operation and all of that. And he was asking me about my reflections as I faced this cancer journey. And as we drove to this meeting, I ended up sharing 2 or 3 things that had really stood out to me. But the number one reflection I shared with him was how it had reminded me powerfully of my mortality. The reality that all of us are going to die one day. And it's just powerful, I think, to meditate on that fact, to be reminded for all of us, we are mortal beings. And unless Jesus returns in our lifetime, every single one of us is going to die. And it should really make us stop and think, what really counts in life? And that's the key question I'd like to wrestle with you for a few minutes this morning. How should we live in light of our death? How should we go about living life in light of the fact that each of us are mortal? And that's the question that the writers of a beautiful psalm wrestle with in the book of Psalms in the Old Testament. It's Psalm 49, and it's written by a group called the sons of Carr. They were the worship leaders of ancient Israel. And they write Psalm 49 to help us reflect on the fact that all of us are mortal, all of us are going to die one day, and we should actually live our lives well and carefully in light of that fact. Psalm 49 is actually called a wisdom psalm by scholars. It's providing us wisdom for how we should live life. And Psalm 49 has 3 basic moves to it. Listen, remember, and reflect. That's what the authors are going to invite us to do. Listen, remember, and reflect. So the first thing they do is they call us to listen. In the opening verses of the psalm, they're inviting us to listen into them, to listen up. Here's how the psalm begins in verses 1 and 2. Hear this, all you peoples. Listen, all who live in this world, both low and high, rich and poor alike. So they begin with this summons to listen. And you'll notice it's addressed to all peoples of the world, all nations. This isn't just wisdom for God's people, the people of Israel. This is wisdom for everyone. And it's so the sons of Korah are putting out the call, the invitation. Hey, listen up, lean in. Doesn't matter who you are, whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish, whether you are rich or poor, whether you're nobility or a peasant. It doesn't matter whether you're young or old or rich or poor. Every single one of us need to consider the lesson of the psalm. So they're issuing this invitation to, hey, come, listen up. Let's lean in and really hear what this psalm has to teach us. And I think that invitation is important for all of us to hear, but I especially want to suggest today it's important for those of you who are younger, for teenagers and for young adults to really think about this psalm. Because the younger we are, the easier it is for us to think, well, death is a long way off. But the truth is, it isn't. And there's no guarantee of that. Almost 20 years ago, our church had to walk through a tragedy that galvanised the entire nation of New Zealand. 6 students and a teacher from Elam Christian College tragically passed away in a canyonine accident. One of those students was a beautiful young woman in our church named Natasha Bray. She babysat our little boys. She was one of the most dynamic young people I've ever met. And at 16 years old, her life was over. When I preached this sermon in our church here in Auckland a couple of years ago, the very weekend I preached, close friends had to rush to Auckland Hospital because their 18-year-old daughter was lying in a coma in a hospital bed. They discovered that she had contracted meningococcal meningitis, and it was touch and go. Thankfully, she survived. She's gone on to live a flourishing life, no adverse effects at all. But 2 powerful reminders. It doesn't matter how young or old you are, death is a reality for every one of us. And so the sons of Korah are calling us, inviting us, hey, listen, lean in and listen to what this psalm is telling us. Having invited us to listen, the next move in the middle of the psalm is a call to remember. It's an invitation to remember a reality that all of us know, and it's this: death stalks every one of us. All of us are mortal. All of us are going to die, and they want us to remember that and to think about that and to face that reality. The first part of the middle section begins by talking about the wealthy and the powerful, and the psalmist is saying, we're not worried about that, and that doesn't concern us. And the reason they explain is because all of us ultimately die. It's a level playing field for humanity. All of us face death. And that's really what the psalm is all about. So they write these words in verses 10 to 11 in the middle part of this middle paragraph. They write verse 10, "For all can see that the wise die, and that the foolish and the senseless also perish, leaving their wealth to others." All of us are going to face death. Verse 11, "Their tombs will remain their houses forever, their dwellings for endless generations, though they had named lands after themselves." It was Benjamin Franklin, the great American inventor and statesman, who coined the famous phrase that nothing is certain in life except death and taxes. And death is a certainty, friends. You know, last time I checked, medical studies have shown that the mortality rate for human beings is 100%. None of us escape death. All of us have to face that reality. And that's what the psalm is wanting us to remember. Hey, listen, lean in and remember this reality. We will all die. And it doesn't matter how famous we were, how wealthy we were, it's the reality for all of us. I love the little point they make at the end of verse 11, where they say their tombs will remain their houses forever, their dwellings, though they had named lands after themselves. Even the most famous, in other words, die and are forgotten. We live in the East Auckland area of of Auckland, near the Botany Town Centre, if you're familiar with that. And when we moved out to this area about 20 years ago, we were really surprised. Right next to Botany Town Centre is this beautiful reserve that has these lovely walkways through parklands and this lovely pond in the middle of it. It's just right across the road from the town centre, the shopping mall. And what we discovered as we explored that one day with our 2 little children at that point was that it was named Logan Carr Reserve. The irony of that is that our little 4-year-old toddler was named Harrison, our oldest son, and then we only had 2 at that point, and our second son, his name is Logan Carr. So we're walking through this reserve with our 2-year-old called Logan Carr, and the reserve is named after him. And of course it wasn't named after our son, it was named after a local politician in that area that for more than 20 years had served the people of our part of Auckland, and so they named this reserve after him. And what I discovered, I had to research that to find out about this Logan Carr, this figure that had been a very powerful person through the 50s, 60s and 70s here in East Auckland. But, he passed away a few years ago, and now no one really knows who he is. I can guarantee you that if I wandered down to Botany Town Centre and walked through the shopping mall and stopped 100 random people and pointed out to the reserve across the road and said, "Do you know who Logan Carr is?" I reckon about 97% would have no idea who Logan Carr was, and the other 3% would probably know our son, who's now in his 20s. Unless we bumped into a family member, that politician named Logan Carr, he's dead and he's forgotten. And that's what the psalmists are wanting us to understand. Friends, remember this, death stalks all of us, and one day every single one of us are going to die. They underline that in the final verse of this middle stanza, verse 12. And I love the way Eugene Peterson actually renders all these verses. Let me read from verse 10. He says, "Anyone can see that the brightest and best die, wiped out right along with fools and idiots. They leave their prowess behind and they move into their new home, the coffin, and the cemetery is their permanent address." That's the reality that we face. And then verse 12, I love the way Eugene Peterson renders this too to finish this stanza. He says, "We aren't immortal. We don't last long. Like our dogs, we age and we weaken and we die." It reminds me of, we have a famous story in our family that comes from Rochelle's mother. Her name is Elaine. She's one of the most positive people you could ever meet. But there's the story when Rochelle was early high school age, her younger brother Mark was an intermediate. And Mark came out one school day one morning and he was kind of feeling sick and not feeling, coming down with something, and he really didn't want to go to school. And so you know what it's like. All of us did this as kids, where you don't want to go to school, and so you kind of magnify the symptoms and you come out and you're holding yourself and you go, "Oh, Mum, I just don't feel good." And Elaine immediately just turned around and she came out with this line that's become famous in our family. She's just looked at her son and said, "We're all slowly dying." And we laugh about that and we use that line at different times in our family. We're all slowly dying. But it's completely true. We're all slowly dying. All of us are going to face death. It's just the reality of our lives. And what this psalm is calling us to is something really important. This is the key idea of what the psalm is saying. Live a life that counts in light of the countdown. Live a life that counts in light of the countdown. What do I mean by the countdown? Simply that the clock is ticking. That all of us have a fixed time on earth, and that clock is going to wind down to 0 and we're going to die. The day of our death is coming for all of us, and we don't know when, but the clock is ticking. Whenever I preach in our church in Auckland, the nasty tech people in our church, as soon as I begin my sermon, up on the screen on the back wall that I can see above and behind all of the audience, a clock begins a countdown. They begin it at 30 minutes, which is how long our messages are meant to be, and it begins to count down. And the audience have no idea that behind them a countdown is happening. And friends, I want to suggest that's exactly what life is like for every one of us. You have a countdown. You can't see it. You don't know how long you have. I have a countdown on my life, and I don't know how long I have. But whether it's 40 years or 14 years or 4 years or 4 months, the clock is ticking for every one of us. And that's what the sons of Korah want us to understand. Listen, lean in, think about this. Remember, we're all mortal. Death is stalking every one of us. And so they say, reflect. Let's reflect on this reality and let's ensure that we live a life that counts in light of the countdown. So what does it mean to reflect on this reality? Well, what they're going to do in the last part of Psalm 49 is they're going to present to us two possible ways to live, two roads that we can walk, and they contrast those as they begin this last stanza. Listen to this contrast in verses 13 and 14. They sing, "This is the fate of those who trust in themselves. They are like sheep and are destined to die, and death will be their shepherd. But the upright will prevail over them in the morning." So notice there's a contrast between those who trust in themselves and the upright. And then they continue and they do it again. "Their forms will decay in the grave, far from their princely mansions. But God will redeem me from the realm of the dead. He will surely take me to himself." So you notice there's two paths here that the sons of Korah want us to reflect about as we think about death. There's those who trust in themselves, and there's those like the authors that trust in God. There are those who death will be the shepherd hanging around them and guiding them into death, or God will be our shepherd, guiding us through death. And so the sons of Korah want us to understand that and make this choice. Will we be those who trust in themselves, or will we be those who trust in God? And in verse 15, you may have noticed there, they talk about how God will redeem me, which means to purchase me from the realm of the dead. They'd actually introduced that concept back in the second stanza in verses 7 and 8. Here's what they wrote there. They said, "No one can redeem the life of another, or give to God a ransom for them. The ransom for a life is costly, and no payment is ever enough." In other words, it doesn't matter if you are the wealthiest billionaire in the world, you can't cheat death. You haven't got enough money to buy death off so that you won't have to face it. But what they're now saying as they come towards the end of the psalm is, but God can redeem us from death. God is powerful enough to save us from death and to give us life that will last forever if we trust in Him. It's this promise of life that they hold out for us. So listen, lean in. This is a message for all of us, no matter who we are. Remember that death stalks all of us and we have to face our mortality. And then reflect. How will you live in light of the countdown? Let's live a life that counts with God. So as we finish, what does that mean? What does it mean for us to live a life that counts? I want to give two simple suggestions today as we close. Number one, put your trust in God. Put your trust in God. You see, what the psalm is pointing out is that none of us can get away with death. None of us can cheat death. None of us can buy our way out from dying. But God can save us from death. That God can actually give us a promise of life if we would trust Him to do that. And that's why Jesus came and stepped into our world. During Jesus' earthly life, He had a very close friend by the name of Lazarus. And in one of the four Gospels, the biographies of Jesus in the New Testament, Lazarus ends up dying. And in John chapter 11, Jesus will go to his village 4 days after Lazarus has died, and He raises Lazarus from the dead to show that He, Jesus, has the power to do that. But before He raises Lazarus from the dead, He's talking to one of Lazarus' sisters, and He says these words in John chapter 11. Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never ultimately die. Do you believe this? Do you believe this? You see, Jesus came into our world to do exactly what Psalm 49 is talking about, to give his life as a ransom for us. And Jesus lived the life that we couldn't live, and he went to the cross and he died and paid the penalty for our sins and our failures and our mess-ups, so that if we choose to stop trusting in ourselves, taking that road, and instead choose to trust in him as the one who conquers death and takes away our sin, he can promise us life forever, because he's the resurrection and the life. And when we choose to trust in him, we find forgiveness for our sins, we find a whole new start and a hope we never had. We're adopted into God's family, we're given a love that will never let us go, and he promises even if we die, we will be raised to life and we will live with him forever. And friends, if you're listening to this and you've never actually made that decision to put your trust in Jesus, you can do it right now in this very moment in your heart. Just reach out to Jesus and ask him to step into your life and to save you and to make you his. So one of the responses in terms of how do we live a life that counts, it's put your trust in God. And then the second thing I want to suggest as we finish is live your life for God. Put your trust in God and live your life for God. That's where the sons of Carr are going to end Psalm 49. That's going to be their call. They're going to say to us, don't pursue wealth and riches. Don't pursue power and popularity. Don't give your life to things that don't ultimately matter and will never last. So here's what they say in verses 16 and 17. And again, I'm going to use the Message paraphrase because it's so powerful. They write, don't be impressed with those who get rich and pile up fame and fortune. They can't take it with them. Fame and fortune all get left behind. It's exactly the same point that Jesus made in one of his parables, which is a made-up story, fictional story, that gets across a spiritual truth. And at one point, Jesus tells this parable about a wealthy businessman. He sees an opportunity in the market. He senses where the trends are going. And so he makes this huge play. He pulls down, in their world, he pulls down all of the barns that he has for storing food products. And he uses that money to create even bigger ones. It's a gamble financially, but his investment pays off. He actually predicts the way the market is moving and he makes an absolute killing. This rich businessman becomes uber wealthy, and he's a complete success story when it comes to his business world. And so he throws this big party for all his whānau and friends, and they gather and they celebrate. And this is the way that Jesus is telling the story. But then Jesus ends it with these powerful words. But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And then who is going to get all of this that you've prepared for yourself?" Why was that man a fool? Because the countdown finished. His life hit the zero and he died. And he was a fool because he failed to live a life that actually really counted in light of his death. And so this psalm is calling us, friends, put your trust in God and then live a life for God. Live a life that actually counts in light of our death and in light of eternity. Friends, right now at the street, you are in the middle of this series on the Multiply vision. And Simon and Jenny are sharing with you the vision of your church leadership to become this movement that multiplies. To be a church that multiplies disciples and multiplies leaders and multiplies churches. And friends, I just want to say, that's the kind of thing that counts for eternity. That's the kind of thing that matters. That's what we should be investing in. And my urging to you, my encouragement to you, is to live a life that counts in light of the countdown. Be a part of this Multiply vision. Respond to what God might be calling you to do. Get involved and get engaged, because that's the stuff that really matters. When we get to eternity, We're not going to care how many billable hours we racked up at work. We're not going to care how many square meters our house was. We're not going to be worried about how high our Kiwi Saver balance was. It won't matter how many adrenaline pumping experiences we had in our lives. What's going to matter is that we were part of things like multiplying disciples and multiplying leaders and multiplying churches. That's the stuff that matters for eternity. So friends, let's make sure our lives count in light of death and in light of eternity. Let's invest our lives in people. Let's pour our lives into others and disciple and mentor them. Let's pray like crazy. Let's increase the fervency of our prayers for friends and family members who don't know Jesus yet. Let's forgive freely. Let's stop holding on to silly grudges and let's just freely forgive debts that people owe us and just be willing to extend the incredible forgiveness we've received. Let's just pass that on to others. Let's serve other people. Let's choose to lower ourselves and not worry about acclaim and just give our lives away to others. Let's give generously. Let's, in light of eternity, take the resources that we have that we can't take with us and let's invest those for God's kingdom. And let's step out in faith. As you listen to this multiply vision over these weeks, can I encourage you to listen for the promptings of the Spirit of God and to say yes to whatever He's calling us? Friends, let's live lives that really matter and that really count for eternity. Let's live a life that counts in light of the countdown. God bless.